Jim, thanks for joining us to talk about your new role as the sheriff of Sacramento. You're the first Black sheriff in the city's history, county's history, I should say. You've lived a life of firsts. You were the first Black mayor of Elk Grove. You're the first elected Black assemblyman for this region. And now you're the first African-American sheriff in county's history. Give our readers and listeners a sense of what goes through your mind in stepping into these places and spaces where you're oftentimes the only African-American, and what's the responsibility that you carry with you in that role, and how those other roles prepared you for this new role.
Well, I was also the sheriff's first Black spokesperson.
Yes, you were.
And what's ironic, you think of California, a state of 40 million people, Larry, and there's only been one Black sheriff ever in the history of California, and that was a sheriff up in Siskiyou County, Sheriff Byrd, many, many years ago. So now I'm number two. And actually, the assistant sheriff of Sonoma County, he got elected in November. He won the runoff, so he'll be the third sheriff come January 3rd. So a lot of first.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of responsibility as a Black man. It's always in your mind. One thing my mom told me as a young kid, life is not fair. You have to work twice as hard as the other guy. So that's always been ingrained in me. And it isn't fair. It's been tough. It's been road bumps along the way. But I think some of those challenges have made me a better person, a stronger person. And no doubt I've stood on the shoulders of other African Americans in the sheriff's department and politics. So it was a tough road to get there, but along the way, it made me a much better person, much more well-rounded.
Yeah. Because I think people don't necessarily know and understand, what's required when you are sometimes the only person in that space. What are some of the things that you've learned over the years that have helped you stand tall on your convictions and the things that you want to stand on?
It's really hard work and determination, because sometimes you're on an island out there by yourself and you've got to persevere. And it'd be so easy sometimes just to roll over and acquiesce, but you really can't do that. You're standing up for what's right and using that experience and the things I've seen, which are valuable. I think they're invaluable to me and they're invaluable to the public. So it hasn't been easy. It's been a tough job, and but it's been a good ride. I've enjoyed it, and this is I'm looking forward to the new journey. It's a new step in life.
Gotcha. All right.
And Jim, again, thank you for joining us, and I think another good starting point for us is, please tell our readers what the job of Sacramento Sheriff entails in terms of the geographic boundaries, the size and demographic makeup of the department, and your primary law enforcement duties and responsibilities, and a little bit about, after that, how the department, the county, and the nation have evolved since you last wore a sheriff's uniform about a decade ago.
Well, Sacramento's about over 700 square miles. It's got almost, I believe, 1.8 million people now, so it's grown quite a bit. So the sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer in the county. He's elected constitutional officer. I've got about 2,000 employees in the sheriff's department, 1,200 sworn officers. So there's a lot going on. Besides having, we patrol, we deal with that, and we've got detectives and specialty bureaus. We're also responsible for maintaining the jails. We've got 2 jails, one in downtown Sacramento, one in Elk Grove. We have a work release facility in downtown Sacramento. We've also registered sex offenders. We run the courts, so there's really a myriad of responsibilities the sheriff has. Civil actions, we have a civil bureau that serves evictions, civil notices, many things like that. So it's just it's an all-encompassing job. And what the difference is between a sheriff and police chief, obviously with a police chief, you've got a city manager or the mayor or council that have a great deal of influence, versus the sheriff's department, you're elected. So you're accountable to the people. So you have much more autonomy.
Yeah. To that point about being elected, one of the things that you talked about stepping into the election was, you kind of had we asked you about 3 main things. You mentioned homelessness, obviously violent crime, and blight. But in there, you also framed it in the space of transparency. and the challenges that the outgoing administration has had with transparency, particularly to communities of color. Talk to us about that role of being transparent, and what do you want to do as sheriff to make the sheriff's department seem and be more transparent to the community?
Well, I'll tell you, Larry, going to the legislature was a good learning curve to go there and deal with different people, have different thoughts, different views, because sometimes in law enforcement, you're in an echo chamber. You're hearing the same thing repeated over and over again. So you go there and learn how to work with people. You compromise because you're trying to get a bill through 2 houses, multiple committees, and hopefully the governor will sign your bill.
Right.
So you learn that and hear what people want. And I think during the past 8 years, just to be transparent, to talk, to have a relationship. It doesn't have to be adversarial. We can disagree on things, but we can be cordial. So to me, it takes a lot more effort to be adversarial than it is to try and get along and just recognize that. So to me, the public wants transparency to talk about some of those things and talk about real issues. And sometimes it cuts both ways. So I think we're going to see that. I'm willing to sit down and meet with anybody and have a discussion with anybody. I'm not going to close anybody out or lock anybody out. And transparency is not a bad thing.
Right.
Like I said, we can agree to disagree, but it doesn't have to go beyond that.
Are you planning on doing anything like advisory boards or groups or meeting with the community on a regular basis or anything like
Yes,
that?
I am. So we're going to meet with the groups, especially the ethnic groups, talk with them. I've worked with the chambers quite a bit, the ethnic chambers, and just really talk about issues and how we can help and how we can be a better partner with that. Obviously we're down positions. We're down about 200 positions, 100 non-sworn, 100 sworn staff. That's come down some, but we want to hire folks and really represent the community.
Gotcha. So recruitment is also one of the other things that you mentioned too, right?
It's key. It's key. But right now it's hard to hire law enforcement because people saw what's transpired the last several years, and in some circumstances, who wants to really work in law enforcement?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's tough to hire. And you're competing with other agencies.
Sure.
And some of them have signing bonuses. So right now it's really tough to hire people.
So tell us just kind of what your view is for. I'm assuming you have to do something with recruitment as far as the lead. What do you plan on doing? Is there any sort of particular outreach, different ideas that you've seen work in other counties or jurisdictions that you could maybe bring?
Sure, I think everywhere. The military is a great source. We see a lot of young men and women in the military that are getting out that want a job. It's a very well-paying job. It's got a good retirement. So we're just trying to broaden it. Right now, we have no full-time recruiters in the sheriff's department. It's done part-time, and really you need full-time recruiters to go out there and recruit quality candidates.
Sure.
And CHP's down 1,000 positions statewide, so you're competing against them. So it is tough. And what's going to make the Sacramento Sheriff's Department attractive? That's why I want to go out there myself and also recruit, because I think the men and women we have are the best recruiters. Mm-hmm. And as sheriff, I have a lot of good ideas and experience what the sheriff's department can do to enhance your career.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and just for the readers that might get excited, what is the salary of a sheriff's deputy?
I think starting out, it's probably about $80,000. So that's actually pretty good money.
That's out of college. You could be.
Yeah.
Well,
and obviously, you don't need a college degree.
You don't need a college degree.
But if you have a college degree, you're going to make more money. And if you want to promote down the road, you definitely need a college degree.
Gotcha.
When you talk about recruiting in departments, we know that throughout the nation, we have seen sad examples of law enforcement abuse. And when you look at the case of the lynching of George Floyd, the officer who was convicted of his murder had a whole, jacket full of complaints that had come before. If you were a police chief, say in Minneapolis, and this is evolving, how do you get in front of those kinds of things? I mean, at what point do you tell someone that has a record of over policing or abuse that they gotta step away?
Well, first of all, California is very different. As far as the training goes, our officers are much better trained. The hiring centers are different in California. And really, ultimately, what it comes down to is good supervision. Obviously, there's a sheriff, and you've got chiefs, captains, lieutenants. The key is those sergeants, those first-line supervisors, really doing their job and being engaged with the troops. And as the department's leader, telling them your expectations, what you expect from them, and what they can expect from me. And that's probably the most important thing being engaged. And really it comes down to training. You want people that are trained and to talk about those issues. So because of that, there have been a lot of laws that have been passed that impact law enforcement, some good, some not so good. And but I think everyone's trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. So we're still charting that path and that course. But it's difficult. I mean, obviously crime's up, especially violent crime right now. I got a hearing date at the Board of Supervisors to talk about building additional bed space at the jail. But it's a different California right now. It's a different jail. We see different prison systems. So things have really changed quite a bit over the last, I would say 7 to 8 years.
Thank you.
To kind of, you hit a point that I think is very important to all of us, particularly violent crime. African Americans are overrepresented in both violent crime victims and perpetrators of violent crime. And then you also mentioned being responsible for domestic violence and other areas like that, and sex offenders. Sacramento is probably facing one of its most violent years in history this year. What do you see? What can be done from the sheriff's department to kind of curb violent crime? And I also want to go into kind of your views on the proliferation of guns and their accessibility, and how do we get more guns off the street?
Right. I think I'll answer the gun question first. We have a problem with guns. Guns have always been around. They're going to continue to be around. The issue is folks that are prohibited from owning guns, not legal gun owners, because you go back and look at the stats. Sacramento County has issued a lot of concealed weapons permits, and we haven't had a problem with the permit holders. Where the problem is with folks that are felons that shouldn't be carrying guns. And the downtown K Street shooting was one prime example. Mm-hmm. Those folks were prohibited from carrying guns, yet they carried them. Right. So that really doesn't jive there. And I think ultimately it comes down to, I do think there's a school to prison pipeline. We've done a lot of building in Sacramento, and look around Sacramento where we've improved neighborhoods at. I look at the impoverished neighborhoods that have been that way forever. The South area, the Oak Park, the El Paso Heights, they've been that way 30, 40, 50 years. Mm-hmm. I was out there 30 years ago. The same issues that were present then are present now. We've never changed that. So we have underperforming schools, no banks, no supermarkets, no sports programs or arts programs for kids. So until we invest in those communities, we've got to change that narrative. I live in Elk Grove. Elk Grove is it's a normal community. What Elk Grove does have, they've got 15,000 kids playing youth sports, the largest youth soccer registration in the country, right. The biggest Cal Ripken baseball league west of Mississippi. So a lot of kids engaged in that. Meadowview is just 2 miles away from Laguna Boulevard. Mm-hmm. Free breakfast, free lunch. It's tough. It's a tough environment to grow up in. And I would argue that if those kids had the same opportunities, it'd be very different.
Sure.
And that's really what it comes down to really change the things. Law enforcement's a part of it, but we've got to invest in those communities that have been that way for decades to change the narrative. Until we change that, status quo is going to remain. And that's really the key issue with that. We put a little money in, or different cities having organizations, but it still falls short of what we need to do for our kids and to change that. We know if you're not reading at the third grade level by that time, there's a good chance you're going to fail. Sure. So to me, we only have so much capacity. And for a long time, folks have been focusing on the adults. So down at the downtown jail in Elk Grove, all the inmates have tablets, mm-hmm. iPads, mm-hmm. with connectivity. There's kids that don't have connectivity at home. Sure. So, to me, the kids come first. I don't think any kid desires to be involved in gangs or a drug lifestyle. That's the neighborhood they see, and that's what they grow up in. That's normal to them. We've got to change that narrative and save those kids. And that's where it starts at. But once again, it requires a large amount of money to really do that and change it.
So you think in your role as sheriff, and again, as an elected representative, can you be a megaphone to issues like that? And are you planning on doing that?
Yeah, I am. So what was interesting, in the Assembly, I had a academic improvement program. So I took Burbank, Valley High, and Florin High. Said if you improve your citizenship, your GPA and attendance, we're going to put you in a drawing to go to Facebook,
Right.
Google, and the 49er Stadium. They have a STEM program.
Mm-hmm.
So 50 kids from each school got to go do that to give them a buzz, to get them excited about going to college and careers in STEM. And it's just simple things like that to open their eyes. They'd never been there before. They loved Facebook. They loved Google. They loved Levi Stadium, to really change that narrative and expose those kids to something they hadn't seen before. So you're just trying to make it different and trying to really impact their lives.
And because the previous sheriff's department didn't necessarily communicate very well with the board of supervisors, and I think I'm saying that kind of nicely. Is that something that you think that you can help champion at the board level as well too? Because I mean, the county has quite a large budget. They can really impact a lot of this decision making.
Yeah, I've already talked to them. I've got a great relationship, and I've had one in the past. So it'll be better, I think, once I take over. I think it'll be at an all-time high with the board. Just really communicating, talking with them. If we've got issues, let's work it out. I mean, it doesn't need to be adversarial. Like I said, it requires too much energy to be negative versus to get along with people. And I think the county plays an important part in it. A lot of our problems deal with mental illness, and I put the monkey on the state's back. The state's done nothing to deal with mental illness, and that's a big issue right now. And also substance abuse. If you have a job in a house, it's hard to get off of drugs or alcohol, let alone if you're homeless or you're poor. So that's where we need to really focus on that. And the state has been very heavy, and local jurisdictions, on housing. We spent $20 billion on homelessness, and it's gotten worse. These rich liberals that, they think they know what's better for people of color, and they're driving that narrative. And, we've got to take it back and drive it ourselves.
No, you're really hitting on some very important points. And let's stay with homelessness for a while, since apparently the numbers keep going up. And again, from the sheriff's department's point of view, what can you and your staff do to try to address this or mitigate it, or how should this work in terms of trying to start addressing and solving this problem?
Sure. Well, number one, it's not a crime to be homeless. It's not against the law to be homeless.
Right.
That's happened to a lot of people. But when you really dig down deep, no one in this county, no one in this state can tell you what the percentages are of folks that want help, folks that are too mentally ill to make a decision to get help, and folks that just don't want help because of substance abuse. So we know those numbers are pretty significant of folks that don't want help for whatever reason. So, how do we change that? For the homeless camps, we've had about a dozen murders, homeless on homeless, besides the murder of the Ranch Cordova lady and the other incidents that have happened this past year. So a lot of sexual assaults happen in the homeless camps, a lot of drug dealing. So I think there's been a kind of a hands-off approach with law enforcement. They've left the homeless camps alone. You can still enforce the laws in the homeless camp. Obviously, everyone says Boise decision, where if you move them off public property, you have to have a place for them to go. And that's true. But we can deal with that. And I think we're solving that problem somewhat. But it comes back to the underlying problems, mental illness and substance abuse. And there are folks that are okay in this state with someone walking around naked, eating out of a trash can because they have their freedom, versus being the adult in the room and saying, you know what, hey, we're going to do a conservancy, taking into protective custody. That is a bad word. I'm sorry, not conservancy, conservatorship. Right. Conservatorship's a bad word. So the option is just to leave them in the state they are. Because some folks go and they get treatment, they get on meds, and they get normal again. So we've got to do something, because what we've been doing has not worked. You look at LA and the homelessness there, it is out of control. It is out of control. So there's no way, if someone's got a substance abuse problem, there's no way to force them into treatment. Before you had drug court, and the judges had a hammer to put on them. And for a lot of folks, it may take 2 or 3 times to get rehabilitation for it to be effective. But it's just a vicious cycle with this. And we've got to solve it at some point. Like I said, until you address those 2 issues, it's going to continue as it is.
Wow. And again, you mentioned some key markers, mental illness and substance abuse. But the numbers, as you've indicated, both in Sacramento and certainly in LA, of people that are homeless seem to be increasing. Um, you talked about a little bit of the root causes here,
Right.
but and you said what the city and the counties have been doing really don't seem to be doing particularly well, because the numbers of people that are homeless are increasing. And again, the question is, why do you see those numbers sort of spiraling up? And again, what if some people don't want treatment, what can you as an agency, along with other agencies, do to try and get them out of homelessness?
I think part of it has to be mandatory treatment. If someone's mentally ill, the jails should not be mental health hospitals. And that's what the jails are right now. And that's part of this whole lawsuit that we're going through the consent decree, is because I've seen folks come to the jail, get on medication, and be okay. So if you're having a mental health crisis right now in the county, there's nowhere to go. You go to the emergency room, the doctors want to get you out of there as fast as possible because you're eating up bed space. You're in a hallway somewhere. If you have a substance abuse problem, unless you have benefits, there are no treatment programs for substance abuse. So those are the primary issues. And then also, if you say anything against the homeless, or you want to do something out of the box, you're anti-homeless. So that you're stigmatized right away. Oh, you're just against homeless. No, it's not that way. No, you want to help the homeless and make their lives better. But you have these folks that are out there, the advocates, that no, we can't do a conservancy. Well, where else do they go? The status quo is not okay. We've got to change that narrative and try and give them help. And some may never be able to get mentally stable. So the alternative is leave them out there versus giving them someplace they've got shelter and food they're taken care of. And we're talking long term. Are these people going to be in this long term forever? Or how do you try and get and move those folks out of that?
Do you know of any cities in the country that are doing a better job with this?
I think there's some, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel to go around. And, some folks have. I haven't had a chance yet. I know some programs to go around and really see what works and have the counselors and intervention. And it's tough sometimes. People just are set in their ways. But in talking to folks, and one thing I do know, there's a segment that, like I said, don't want help for whatever reasons. No one can tell you what the numbers are. Nobody. So when we start addressing this issue come January, we're going to keep track of it to see, so we can go back and tell the public, hey, here's what we found out so far. Look at the bike trail, the American River Bike Trail, 100 fires in the past 2 years. It's eaten up an enormous amount of resources. And that's because of the homeless living there. So we've got to get them off and get them appropriate housing. Those that want appropriate housing, those that don't want appropriate housing, they've got to move and go somewhere else.
And I travel through the bike trails quite often, and they say the numbers in Sacramento County that about 40% of the homeless are African American. I would wage to say that in the bike trail areas, that number is much higher of African Americans. I would say it's more closer to 60 to 65% of African Americans who are homeless. When we have big events, marathon, and we just had the bike.
Yes.
Yeah.
Amgen tour.
Yeah, and I noticed that they somehow get the homeless out of the bike trail areas,
right? And
they clean the area up pretty nicely. I
right.
don't know where they go at that time, and I don't know if you know.
No.
All right, that's why.
When NCAA came to town, they were. They make sure
they find ways to move them at certain times. To that point, so there's two things that I know we're getting close on time, but I wanted to ask you about. So you mentioned about how jails should not be kind of like the place where you go for rehabilitation in that regard, as far as mental health and an outpatient. But when a person is released from jail, there's an opportunity, I think, there to get them down a certain path. What is your perspective on that? Because I know you talked about, one of your areas you talked about was blight and just sending people out of jail to nothing. What do you see as a solution to kind of preparing people as they exit out of the criminal justice system?
Well, it's tough. You need a good rehabilitation system. And I'm here to tell you, county jails were built for a year or less. all your county jails. Think about it. The downtown jail is pretrial inmates, so you're waiting to go to trial. You're going to plead out or do a jury trial, whatever. That was a downtown jail. The jail in Elk Grove was for sentenced inmates for a year or less.
Right.
With AB 109, because the state got sued because of overcrowding, they have now shifted that population to the counties. So you have folks being there for 8 years, 10 years in the county jail. They weren't built for that. This lawsuit, that's the main jail, the consent decree, that's over the physical plant, the actual structure of the jail. You cannot change that. That's concrete. For ADA issues, when it was built in 86 and opened in 89, it was compliant then. But since then, the law has changed.
Right.
So you need more room. So just the addition we're talking about building is for a new intake area to comply with ADA and HIPAA, and then a tower for medical issues and psychiatric issues. Department of Corrections got sued. They had to build a hospital in Stockton. So now you're seeing all the county jails sued for that. They took on the state's problem. The old California Youth Authority, DJJ, they're closing next year. They had an award-winning program recognized nationally for sex offenders, youthful sex offenders. Those guys are going to the county now. Think about this. In the small counties, can you replicate that program? No. If you're LA, you can probably replicate it pretty good. But the majority of the 58 counties cannot replicate that. So what does that say for our youthful sex offenders if we're going to try and change them? You're not changing them at all.
Right.
Now you've got 26-year-old men, grown men, walking around in juvenile hall, which makes no sense. Because they wanted to close CYA and get rid of it. That was a big issue. They want to close prisons. So right now, the folks we have, and CDCR says right now, in prison, there are no low-level offenders. In county jail, there are no level offenders. Those are violent felons in the jail. That's who we have now. That's so your county jails have become, in fact, de facto state prisons. State prison, you get your own TV and buy your own TV. County jail, you can't. You have a lot more freedoms in state prison. So I would say for someone to be in county jail for 8 years is kind of inhumane.
Right.
The Department of Corrections was better built to rehab these folks. And think about the 58 counties. They're doing 58 different programs. Really?
Right.
That's why the recidivism rate is high. Even for state prison, it's probably 70%. County jails is probably 70%. So we see a lot of folks that are repeat customers that keep coming back. So, like I said, the drug offenses, the low-level offenders, those have been gone for a long time. So these folks, for whatever reasons, are repeat offenders. Some you can help, some you can't. So one thing I want to do, I'm bringing the trades and the building trades to come in and talk to these individuals about jobs, because obviously if you're in the trades, you can make a pretty good salary and buy a house one day. So we're just trying to do things differently, but it's a tough crowd.
Gotcha.
So it's not easy.
Yeah.
And I recognize that.
And before we go, I do want to ask you about this, because you brought up a point which I think is really critical. You mentioned, the 58 different counties doing different things. Policing in general is almost left up to its, each jurisdiction by itself. I contend that particularly communities of color tend to be over-policed. You think about a neighborhood like Oak Park, you could be detained by SACPD, sheriff, CHP, UCD, UOP, like all of these law enforcement agencies in about a half-mile radius.
Right.
And they all have different ideas and rules, DNA on how they police. Big picture-wise, is there a discussion that can happen about coming up with some baseline standards for law enforcement? And I know there's a lot of talk about, defunding the police or at least reimagining law enforcement and how the first response is to communities. We talked obviously about mental illness, domestic violence, other things like that in some instances don't necessarily require a militarized response.
Right.
Give us a sense, just kind of big picture on what do you think, where do you see law enforcement? Is there a space for change for policing in communities, particularly communities of color?
I think law enforcement has changed. Obviously, defund the police didn't work. We saw what happened in experiments in Seattle, Minneapolis. They went dramatically wrong. I think the big things is what we're dealing with is calls for service. and it comes back in the crimes. You talk about where the shootings at. They're not in Granite Bay, they're not in Roseville, they're not in Arden Park. So if you look at where the calls for service are, it's the crime there. And that's not, law enforcement's left to deal with it. But we've got to do a better job providing services to those individuals where we stop that. So I think in some aspects, because of what's gone on the past 2 or 3 years, you've seen a depolicing in law enforcement where some law enforcement officers, then when that computer beeps, they're going to respond to that call and deal with it. Otherwise, they do nothing proactive whatsoever. Zero. So it's allowed some of these things to fester where, right now, that's why violent crime's up. And the bottom line, and the people that are being killed are people that look like us, Black and brown people, period. So, how do you change that narrative? And I still drive it back to, we've got to improve these kids' lives. Where do you stop it at? And to me, plug that school to prison pipeline with our youth on that. We've got to do that. So it'd be nice to have, one level of policing, but it's really for each area what's going on, what you have right now. Right now, in an area, particularly in the sheriff's department, we've got a mass. It's like prostitution central. It is out of control, and that's because the laws were changed. So it is tough doing that. It's not in the other areas. So we're going to respond to where those calls for service are. We're going to staff to where the calls are, where the issues are. So it's really a delicate balance. You're trying to do that dance and not over police, but also ensure the safety of residents. Because I've seen the polls, Larry. Homelessness is the number one issue, and crime is right behind it. Mm-hmm. And those two are intertwined. Sure. So and people are very concerned, even people of color. Yeah. They want to feel safe in their neighborhoods. Yeah. So it's always been a tough balance, and it's more delicate these days. So it's there's no silver bullet at all, but I think we have to have a larger emphasis on those community services and really revitalize those neighborhoods.
Is there a place for conversation? And again, I want to come back to this just real quick. Is there a place or a space for a conversation that is happening between law enforcement agencies to talk about that in regions? So like, again, you're in charge with also for Rancho Cordova Police, right?
Yes.
So is there conversations about, how do we, multiple jurisdictions, multiple agencies, police this community in particular? Can you be a convener of that?
The conversation's happening. It's just it's not an easy job. This is not an easy job to do.
Yeah.
And you're dealing with human beings. They're not machines.
Yeah.
And most of the time people have good judgment. Sometimes they have bad judgment and do dumb things. So you can do 1,000 good things and one bad thing happens. Sure. Yeah, it impacts everyone. So it's like I said, it's in this day and age, it's very difficult to do this job and to deal with some things. But ultimately, it comes down. I keep going back to our children. They have to have a chance, and we've got to focus on them and give them the resources. And depending on what school you're in, there's some great school districts, and there's some school districts that don't do that well.
Sure.
So that to me, we've got to focus on that. Everything comes back on law enforcement, homelessness, crime, blah blah blah. It's not all law enforcement's problem. Law enforcement didn't create it.
Yeah.
So we've got to work together and be a good partner working with those other folks to try and change the narrative.
Thank you. Let me bring up one other thing on this, and this goes back to gun violence.
Right.
And you said something interesting. You don't think the concealed weapons permits are really a source of a problem. The people that have the permits are not the ones that are creating the violence. There are stolen guns or felons that use them. Around the country, people are talking about, I don't know if they're called red flag laws or whatever. And this goes back to the mass murder out of the Mandalay Bay Hotel in Las Vegas,
right,
where the guy was in a room with 20 weapons, many of them semi-automatic weapons. And I think he bought a bunch like just before he went in. And this is a case where if there is some sort of a red flag law, we're talking about a gun dealer calling the sheriff's department when somebody comes in to buy a whole bunch of semi-automatic weapons. Because what do you need a semi-automatic weapon for? You're not going to go deer hunting with
sure,
it, obviously. So what would you support as a way to get in front of the purchase and use of some of these weapons?
So as far as the concealed weapons permit holders go, the numbers are there. We've got the statistics. they just aren't involved in these incidents. It's folks that are prohibited from owning guns. And California has some of the strictest gun laws in the nation. It hasn't stopped gun violence. As I alluded to earlier, the K Street shooting, those folks were convicted felons. They're prohibited from owning guns. They had prior gun charges. So right now, this day and age, in the mind of individuals out there, there is no accountability. They know they're not going to get in trouble or do serious time. So a lot of folks are carrying guns these days that shouldn't be carrying guns. So, and then at the same time, you try and enhance penalties on that. The legislature does not want to, even for ghost guns, to try and enhance the penalty of someone's possession of ghost guns. The legislature doesn't want to pass laws on that. So it's always been an issue. The legislature right now is in the mode they will not sign into law anything that puts anybody in jail or prison, even if it's for that. So it's just people need to figure out what they want. And I'll give you a good example. Hate crimes are off the hook right now, especially with the API community. It's up dramatically. We've seen the videos, people getting assaulted, beaten up, even killed. LGBTQ community, hate crimes are up dramatically. Transgender, like I guess 80 or 90%. The Jewish community, hate crimes are up high. Muslim community, hate crimes are up high. Right now in California, a hate crime is not considered a violent felony. Even if you burn a place of worship down, and if you go to prison behind a hate crime, you did something really, really bad. So if you get convicted and sentenced, you're eligible for early release for a hate crime right now. So you would kind of think, okay, the API community, Jewish community, LGBTQ community, Muslim community would jump behind that and say, okay, yeah, if someone does a hate crime and goes to prison, they should do most of their sentence and not get out early. But it's not that way. None of those communities, and there were several hate crimes bill that addressed that, got behind it. Because people are more worried about their progressive credentials. When I'm a Democrat, than doing what's right for their people. Women's Caucus, same thing. California, you can drug and rape a woman. It's not a violent crime. It's not a violent crime to human traffic a child. To pimp a kid, it's not a violent crime. It's not a violent crime to rape someone developmentally disabled. Where's the Women's Caucus at? Women's groups behind that. They're not behind it. I ran those bills. So it's one of those things. I want to keep my credentials or my scorecard instead of doing what's right. That's really what it comes down to. Doesn't matter what your party is. It's doing what's right for who you claim to represent. And that has not happened.
Yeah.
I firsthand front row seat there.
Yeah. And even though even the violent crime, hate crimes are up in all those communities, still African Americans are still the primary subject, of target of hate crimes.
Yeah, and we should do something about it.
Yeah.
Like I said, and we're talking felony hate crimes where it's great bodily injury or something bad happens.
Sure.
You aren't adding to their sentence. All it says is you're not eligible for early release. What is so wrong with that?
Last question. I just want to ask you, you've been wanting this position for a while. Are you happy? What do you feel like? What do you think is this next chapter what's this next chapter gonna look like for you?
And what are you going to tackle first?
Well, number one is bittersweet because I love the legislature. I had a great time there. I was there 8 years. I had 4 years left.
Right.
So I didn't have to go. I was in a safe seat. And then to give that seat up and run for this, and you always hope you're going to win, but you never know. And but there I'm one of 120. And here you're the sheriff of Sacramento County. It's the state capital, so you're a big voice on a soapbox. So I think you can impact and get a lot of change done. I think being a person of color, people see that. I think that adds to it. So to me, it was the right time. It's going to be a tough job. It's going to be much harder than the legislature. I think Dan Hahn said it best. You can be at home asleep in your bed and get in trouble for something someone else did. Yeah, that's real talk. But at the same time, I know what my values are, what I want to see, what I want done. So I'm going to impart that down and really hold my supervisors accountable. Because if they're doing their job, a lot of these problems shouldn't be happening. My first issue is homelessness, tackle homelessness. I can't do it alone. I've got to work with other agencies, but we're going to be compassionate, but we're going to be firm. It happened. Enforce the laws. There are laws in the books right now. We don't need any more laws. Enforce the laws we have.